George, in the schools, they teach you about George Washington. George Washington, our schools and our educational system puts into us these figures, but we're going to keep on with George Jackson, Soledad brother. Our schools are a training ground to get us in a state of mind. And I would argue that George Washington, the so-called founding father of the United States, was no worse or better than Hitler. I'll say that again. The folks y'all revere, the founding father, George Washington, was no better than Hitler. He did the same thing. Actually, he did worse than Hitler. He was committing genocide against the Native Americans. He enslaved people. He put together a white supremacist country. That's George Washington. So our mission, what we have to do is change the narrative. Who are our real heroes? Who are they? And one of those is George Jackson, who fought against this oppressive society. I know some of you might get mad at me, that's our founding fathers, racist, genocidal maniacs. So we have to change that narrative at some time, and that's what we're going to do. So the first part of the program is going to be a sister talking about what is Black August and what does it mean to all of us. Then the second half, we're going to talk to a sister who lives in Burkina Faso. Oh, amazing. Inem Richardson. A lot of you don't hear about Burkina Faso on other stations. Even on this station, you rarely hear it because of the domination by, I would say, liberal racist. Yes, I said it. And they don't want to deal with Burkina Faso. And I was driving in today and I was hearing on the radio what's going on in the Congo with Ebola. And I'm saying, I wonder if this is one of those genetically engineered diseases that the United States loves to put on people because of those mineral resources there. But anyway, I don't want to take a lot of time. And then we'll open up the calls, short calls if you call in, 818-985-5735, hit option 1. I'll say it slower. 818-985-5735, hit option 1. Probably during the halftime of the show, we'll take short calls. Make them short if you want comments or questions or suggestions, criticism, all that and above. So that's the number to call. And I'd like to thank, before we start, those people who called in and subscribed to the station, because we can only do this with your support. And if you did, you can always go to kpfk.org and subscribe. So, okay, I had it right. Yeah, thank you. I have to thank the support folks here at KPFK, boy, they keep me going. Charlie and Will, yeah, they're sitting up here checking everything out, saying, okay, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so we're going to go to the first interview. Aya Fubara Eneli, an attorney. And I'm only going to play the first half of it, but she got down. She was on fire. So we'll play the second half, possibly before the month is out, if not the beginning of September. So there you have it. And let me see if this works. Here we go.
Sam, I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I have 5 children, and I run my own law firm. We have a mentoring group for girls in my community, and then we also opened up a library, the first public library in Opobo in Nigeria.
This is Black August. And as you know, Black August is, well, you tell us what Black August is, and you give us your take on it, the history of it, and what we should do.
First and foremost, thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you and with your audience. I'm very humbled by the invitation and definitely by the work that you're doing and have been doing for a very long time. So thank you. Interestingly enough, Black August is something that I'm realizing that a lot of people, even within the Black community, are not necessarily aware of. So bringing this to the forefront is really important for a number of reasons. So when we look at the history of Black August, it's not a party. We're not, it's not just a hashtag. This is this commemoration is what I look at. It's how I look at it. Began inside the walls of San Quentin State Prison, and it was born out of grief. It was born out of discipline. It was born out of, I call them warriors within our community who decided that they could not just sit back and let us be attacked and killed without a response. Now, that response may look different for each person, but it was an act of resistance, and it was a direct response to state violence against incarcerated Black revolutionaries. So since 1979, organizers of Black August have observed it with a strict, some might even call it monastic set of practices. And the goal, or some of these practices with Black August include fasting from sunup to sundown. So people are used to fasting for religious reasons. But when it comes to us fighting for our liberation, we may not be as engaged as we could be. Also, because of the history that comes with when you resist. Some of you may remember the song "Strange Fruits," right? There are different ways we've been impacted when we resist, including the incarceration of these Black revolutionaries. So, the practices include fasting from sunup to sundown, physical and political study, because if we don't know who we are, if we don't know our history, then it's so much easier to control us. That's one of the reasons why across the country and here in the state of Texas, where I reside, the legislature has worked very hard to restrict what kinds of history is being taught within our schools with their anti-CRT bill. It also includes exercise, because you cannot be a revolutionary and talk about liberating yourself or your people if you have not disciplined your body as well, if you're not in good physical shape. And so we know statistically that African Americans have a shorter lifespan than, for instance, white Americans. And so what are we doing to take care of our bodies? It also includes abstention from alcohol, abstention from drugs, abstention from radio and television. And now I think they've got to update it and say maybe even abstention from all the devices that we have in our hands all day long. So the idea was and is that if our brothers and sisters can survive solitary confinement, the least the rest of us can do is discipline our own bodies and minds in solidarity. So Black August asks a simple question: who do we say is a criminal and who decides? Because so many of the men and women who are currently incarcerated, who are political prisoners, although the United States of America does not use that term in relation to its own prisoners, but applies it to prisoners in other countries. So many of those people have the kind of harsh sentences that they have because they were fighting for our liberation. And they're not just common criminals, certainly in the eyes of the people who love them. They were revolutionaries who the state of California, this is where it started, and the federal government considered dangerous enough to kill. So let me stop there.
Wow, that's very deep, I must say. And San Quentin does have a history. I remember, as my audience knows, I went there twice to interview Geronimo G. Jaga Pratt, who was wrongly convicted and incarcerated for because he was a revolutionary. Let's just cut to the chase. He was a revolutionary. That's why he was incarcerated. Could you share with us, like who started it? I know
George Jackson.
George
Yes,
Jackson,
Soledad
brother.
Brothers.
Yes.
Blood in My Eye are some of the books that he put out at a young age. That's the other thing, that I'll hopefully touch more upon later, is the idea of genocide and that there has been a genocide waged against people of African descent in the United States of America, and there continues to be a genocide. And there's statistics. We've got evidence to back this charge up. But to understand Black August and how it started, you have to understand what California prisons were like at the end of the 1960s, right? You think the Black Panther Party, you think the Black Liberation Army, you think about the FBI and COINTELPRO under J. Edgar Hoover. This was the FBI's counterintelligence program. And according to their own memo, the FBI's own internal memo, this is what they said. COINTELPRO, right? So that this surveillance program that they had was designed to prevent the rise of a Black Messiah. Their goal was to neutralize Black liberation organizations. And so that repression didn't stop at the prison gate. Inside, Black prisoners were organizing, they were reading, they were teaching each other law, teaching each other history and political theory. They were building consciousness, even though the state had tried to deny all of that on the outside, even before they got on the inside. And of course, like I already mentioned, we see that happening across our schools. But this was, a very targeted attack against people of African descent in this country fighting for our liberation. So whether it was infiltration, whether it was putting drugs in our community, whether it's the killing of people like Fred Hampton, you see all of that happening, right? And so guards and prison administrators treated all of that organizing within the prison system as a threat that needed to be crushed. And prisoners who a decade earlier might have served just quiet sentences, hey, we realize that you have re-enslaved us, if you will, were now, quote unquote, radicalizing each other. And the response from the institution was brutal: solitary confinement, retaliatory violence, and quite frankly, killing. So now enters George Jackson. He was 18 years old when he was convicted of a gas station robbery involving $70. That is $70. He was then sentenced to 1 year to life under California's indeterminate sentencing law. Think about that. Right now, we have a felon in chief sitting in the White House who is just signing pardons for insurrectionists, for all of, allegedly signing for buddies who, have paid, into campaign coffers and the like, right? For way more money than $70. But George Jackson, at 18 years old, gets a sentence of 1 year to life. So what that meant is that the parole board and not a judge would decide when George Jackson had done enough time. Has he been a good enough Negro? Do we think he's going to stop organizing? And George Jackson never made it out of prison. He spent 11 years in prison, 7 of them in solitary confinement. Mm. So if those of you listening can just take a moment to just pause and think of what your life would look like if for a month you got something slit open and food slid in there, food that's barely edible, and you were not allowed any communication, any human contact. Maybe you got out an hour, a couple days, whatever. But that was it for 7 years. And you got in as an 8. Yes. And that's why we're saying genocide. And you got in as an 18-year-old. I happen to have a 27-year-old son, a 19-year-old son, a 16-year-old. I can't imagine. Like, you would lose your mind. People are right now depressed and dying of loneliness who are on the outside. So think about that. But anyway, prison did not break George Jackson, though. It transformed him. He used that time and he read voraciously. He was reading Marx and Lenin and Mao and Frantz Fanon. He was reading about the history of colonialism and slavery. He became, in the words of those who studied alongside of him, one of the sharpest political minds of his generation, locked behind bars. He was a self-taught revolutionary theorist writing from inside of a cage. Some of you may have heard of his book, Soledad Brother, which was published in 1970. It's a collection of his prison letters. And of course, you may have heard of his other book, Blood in My Eye. But George Jackson himself speaks as he's writing, you can hear that analytical, that unflinching voice, speaking about how the American prison system functions as a continuation of slavery. Because some of us will say, well, you know, the Emancipation Proclamation and slavery was abolished in 1865. Well, 1863, if you want to go with that. But then we talk about the 13th Amendment. But the 13th Amendment, and I'm saying this as an attorney, left that clause right, except for, and that's if you're convicted of a crime. So all we have to do is criminalize you. And Sharshy McIntyre wrote a book, I think, the criminalization of a race. Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow. So you basically have created a loophole where we can create a law, say that is now a crime. You are convicted of that crime. Now you're enslaved again. So whether we look at the disparities in sentencing between crack cocaine and cocaine powder, some of you may remember that. If you think about the 3 strikes and you're out law that some of us applauded, it's not me, but some people applauded, like, well, this would make our community safer. Meanwhile, what would really make our communities safer is if we provided more access to resources for people to get an education, for proper housing, for health care, for opportunities to actually be able to take care of your family, right? So in what happened next here is in January 1970, a white guard shot and killed 3 Black prisoners during a yard fight at the Soledad prison. A grand jury ruled the shooting justifiable. How many times have we seen that?
Many.
In the days after, in an apparent retaliation, another guard was killed. George Jackson, along with Fleeter Drumgo and John Clochette, were charged with that killing, and they became known as the Soledad Brothers. Jackson always maintained that the charges were retaliation for his organizing. Now, George Jackson had a younger brother named Jonathan, and as a mother, I am just thinking of that mother of these two young men. Jonathan Jackson was only 17 years old, and he watched the state build a case against his brother. And he believed that that case was designed to keep George in prison forever, maybe even kill him there. And so on August 7th, 1970, in the land of the brave, home of the free, however they say that, Jonathan Jackson felt like the only way his brother would be free under this system, this judicial system, was if he got his brother out. And so he walked into the Marin County Courthouse with guns hidden under his coat. And inside there were 2 other Black prisoners, William Christmas and James McLean. And then there was a 3rd man, Rochelle McGee. And Jonathan armed them, and together they took the judge, the prosecutor, and jurors hostage and moved them towards a van with a plan to trade the hostages for the freedom of the Soledad Brothers. Now, I would never, in this case, I will always advocate for self-defense. I would never advocate for violence, but I just want us again to pause to think of the mindset of a 17-year-old boy who had his whole life ahead of him, who nonetheless felt the system is railroading my brother. and this is not fair, and I'm going to do something about it. And that is pretty bold. Um, so the San Quentin guards opened fire on the van as it tried to leave the parking lot. And when all the shooting had stopped, Jonathan Jackson, William Christmas, James McLean, and the judge, Harold Haley, were dead. And Rochelle McGee was the only one of the four prisoners to survive. He was shot, but then he was, of course, rearrested and held in continuous incarceration for decades afterwards. I think he was finally released in, I want to say, 2023, which was also the year he died. So, yes. So just after a year later, after losing his brother, on August 21st, 1971, George Jackson himself was then killed by San Quentin prison guards. Prison officials claimed he had smuggled in a weapon and was attempting to escape. Now, those who knew George Jackson well says they don't believe that. They believe it was an assassination that was timed just days before he was to stand trial for the Soledad brothers case. 3 guards also died that day in the uprising that followed his killing, and 6 Black and Latino prisoners were charged with those deaths. They became known as the San Quentin Six. Now, all of them were ultimately acquitted or had charges dropped on their most serious counts. But that's basically what kind of got all of this going, right? We can also speak about Katari Golden, also known as Jeffrey Katari Golden. He was one of the intellectual architects of the Black August concept. He too was a prisoner and a freedom fighter who died within San Quentin in 1978. And in his case, his comrades described his death as medical neglect. Like there was a slow assassination because he could have received medical treatment, but he was denied treatment. So it was in the memory of Galden, alongside George Jackson, Jonathan Jackson, William Christmas, James McLean, that the first organized Black August observance was held in San Quentin in August of 1979. 9 years after that courthouse rebellion and 8 years after George Jackson's death. Yeah.
Phew, wow. And that's the history of how Black August started. We're talking to Aya Fubara Eneli. Coming down the line, I think Angela Davis, there was a whole thing when she was a part of this. How did she fit into this at all?
So what they charged was that the guns that Jonathan Jackson had used were registered to Angela Davis. And so then she was charged as well. And of course, we know that she was acquitted, and she got support from people like Aretha Franklin, people who came up with the resources to help fight the charges against her. And of course, many of us who remember that famous picture with the afro and the fist up in the air. But yeah, that's how she got implicated with this whole case, was that the guns were registered to her.
So
And of course, I encourage people, you're getting little snippets here, but the books are available. And we spend a lot of time doing and reading and listening to things that don't advance us in any way. Go and read about what these revolutionaries went through and what they have shared, because there are lessons in it for how we should move in the times that we are in today.
And 2 of those books, one is Blood in My Eye, and the other is Soledad Brothers. I think I read Soledad Brothers. I have not read Blood in My Eye. I guess I better grab that. I was thinking about this when you said Angela Davis was charged with, she had registered guns, and she gave them some. There's no law against that, is there? As an attorney?
Well, there is a law if your guns are used in the commission of a crime and you did not report the guns as stolen.
So, well, you gave them to them. That's almost like the ongoing.
The question was she a conspirator? Did she help plan this and arm them? Yes.
Because I know there's lawsuits against gun manufacturers, and I don't know how that's going, because they're saying, well, these guns were used to kill something. So I know there's been some lawsuits, and I don't know what came out of them. Probably nothing, because they have too much money to.
not much yet, because America has been built on violence, and
Yes.
Europe has been, then the Western world has been able to subjugate much of the rest of the world with their superior weapons. And so
Yeah.
yeah, it's going to be hard to take down the gun lobbyists. They spend a lot of money.
Yeah.
So yes.
And by a lot of politicians. So let's pivot to what you said
So
earlier.
so so really quickly, with in terms of Angela Davis, so she was a member of the Communist Party.
Mhm.
And she read about George Jackson and Fleeter Drumgo and John Clochette in the early 1970s. And she did believe, at least that's what she's content, that the murder charges against them were retaliatory, right? And she did become co-chair of the Soledad Brothers Defense Committee. She lectured statewide on prison conditions and corresponded regularly with George Jackson. So she and George Jackson developed a close personal and political bond. She was known as a Marxist. And he also was, quote unquote, becoming a Marxist behind the prison walls as well. So the guns that Jonathan carried into that county courthouse were registered in her name. And so although she was not there, she was named as a suspect in the conspiracy. Of course, she went underground, landed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, was captured in New York 2 months later. She spent about a year and a half in custody awaiting trial on that murder. It was murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy charges. And then the Free Angela campaign became truly a global phenomenon. John Lennon and Yoko Ono wrote a song for her. So did the Rolling Stones. But it was, I believe, June 4th, 1972, when an all-white jury acquitted her on every count. And her co-defendant in that case, Rochelle McGee, the one who had survived the shootout, remained in prison, like I said, for another 5 decades after she walked free. Yeah.
Wow. I have the pleasure here to be interviewing Inem Richardson. We're talking about Burkina Faso. You were raised in the Bay Area, correct?
Yes, I grew up in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area.
How did you but you're living in Burkina Faso?
Yes, I've been living in Burkina Faso for 5 years now. And then increasingly I go back and forth between Burkina Faso and Niger, which is the country next door.
So were you there before the revolution?
I was, very incredibly, I came to Burkina Faso just a little bit before the revolution happened, before President Ibrahim Traoré took power. So I came to Burkina Faso in, let me get this right, it should be like May of 2021. And so Ibrahim Traoré took power then in September of 2022. So
you were good luck.
I guess so. I mean, it's incredible. It's really beyond my wildest imagination, but yeah, I got to witness the entire process of him coming to power.
So what took you there in the first place?
So I was really intrigued by the history of the revolution, the Thomas Sankara legacy, and I had connections to Burkina Faso. I had studied as a student in Senegal, and I'd met students from Burkina Faso. This is like a semester abroad program. I had met students from Burkina Faso while I was there in Dakar, and so I started forming relationships with people in Burkina Faso, and I wanted to know more about the country's history, the legacy of Thomas Sankara, and I became aware that there was a lot of revolutionary change happening in the Sahel, that region of Africa where Burkina Faso was located at the time. So before I actually moved to Burkina Faso, Mali had already had a revolution. This was in 2021 before I came. And that brought to power somebody named Assimi Goïta, who kicked out the French military from Mali. And so the region itself was already on fire. There were all these really dynamic Pan-African, anti-imperialist political movements that were very vibrant. And I thought that Burkina Faso had revolutionary potential because of the history of Thomas Sankara. But I had no idea, when I said like revolutionary potential, I had no idea like how quickly the revolution would come. You know, I thought it would be like in generations to come or something, like the future generations could rebuild the revolution, but I didn't realize, you know, it would be something that would happen so quickly.
So you were that astute where you said, this feels like it could be something happened.
I felt like there was so much potential for revolutionary change because of the heritage of Thomas Sankara, and because of things that were happening in the region, in Mali next door. You know, there were a lot of protests. Even at the time, even Senegal, there were a lot of like anti-imperialist, Pan-African protests and frustration with French neocolonialism. And so the whole region was very like vibrant in terms of like Pan-African energy. And then with the Sankara heritage there, that was so strong. I was like, I want to go and just check this place out. And I didn't realize, for one, I didn't realize the revolution would come so quickly. Two, I didn't realize how long I would stay. Like, I didn't actually even know I was like moving long term to Burkina Faso. I was more just like, let me just stay and see how things go, and you know, until I feel called to go somewhere else. But things just happen so quickly.
And I see you're wearing a Thomas Sankara t-shirt.
Yes, I am. This comes from the Grand Market in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso.
Okay. So when you went to Senegal first to study, now were you what I would call politicized at that time?
Actually, so yes. So my first political experience was with an organization. Funny enough, it's like based out of LA County. Even though I never lived here, I had a lot of connections. Growing up in the Bay Area, I had some friends who moved down here, and they got me connected to a group out here called Chiapas Support Committee, which is based at the 5Cs, the Claremont colleges. It's a student organization with revolutionary politics. And so my friends who went to those schools introduced me to the organization, and it's a really powerful organization. They brought students to different parts of Latin America to learn about socialist and anti-imperialist struggle. So they brought us to Cuba. They brought us to Honduras, to the Garifuna communities, the African communities on the coast. And they told us to go and study abroad somewhere outside of the Western world, and they gave me this assignment. I took it very seriously. They said you have to identify an anti-imperialist organization, and you have to build a relationship with this organization. And so that's how, you know, I felt compelled to go to Senegal. I wanted to know more about Africa, and that's how I came like on a mission to learn about Pan-Africanism.
Did you identify an anti-imperialist organization in Senegal?
I did. So I connected with a group called FRAP, which is, in English we'd say, I guess, the Front for an Anti-Imperialist Popular and Pan-African Revolution, and they were leading a movement called France Dégage, which means like France, get out of here, like get the hell out of here. I don't know if I can say that, but get out of here. Yes. But so I connected with them, and then that's how I started to learn about like how much France controls so much of Africa. Like I didn't have any idea how tight France's control was over its former colonies.
So let me ask you this before we get into the nuts and bolts of what's going on in Burkina Faso, because everybody wants to know, and a lot of stuff we see on YouTube seems like it's AI generated.
It's a lot, yeah.
So we don't really know, but you're young. How do we get? And I was at an event yesterday that you spoke. You were the keynote speaker. A lot of young people there. It reminded me back in my time where everybody was young. Now you don't see that much. How do we move the younger generation to be concerned about international affairs, Pan-Africanism, Black solidarity worldwide? Because now even the older folks, it's just they're just somewhere else.
That's a really good question, and I think it's, in a way, I was very lucky because before I went to Senegal, I thought Pan-Africanism was like an old people's thing. Like I just kind of had a conception of like Pan-Africanists being like this thing for an older generation that none of you care about. And so I have had the tremendous privilege of spending time on the African continent and seeing, like, at least back home, it's a really vibrant youth movement. Like the youth of Africa across, I mean, I've been to so many parts of the continent now.
So you say back home, so you're calling Burkina Faso home.
I'm calling Africa home.
Okay.
And I just want to clarify that, like, for African people listening, like that when I say back home, I mean Mama Africa for all of us, right? But to be there, like I've been able to witness like a really vibrant youth movement across multiple states. And so it's really like the younger generation there that's holding the torch for Pan-Africanism. I think it's harder here because there's so much propaganda, there's a lot of misinformation that's being put in people's heads. But I do think that even when you live in the belly of the beast out here, it's like people are hungry for some sort of solution. There's a dissatisfaction that people have. And I think there's a lot of ways that people try to numb it, and I really hope that more young people can find Pan-Africanism as a solution to that. You have to be engaged in international struggle.
So what you said was you saw the younger people more engaged. They understood Pan-Africanism. At the same time, I see in Ghana, I think there's more of a war, psychological warfare on us here. But it's there too.
Oh, yeah.
Especially in Ghana. My friend who lives there says, man, some of the women are bleaching their skin, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe do you think it's the magnitude of propaganda here versus there? Possibly, I don't know. Because, I mean, and then to be a Christian is to be a Christian, but I was so disappointed when I saw so many white Jesuses in Ghana.
Yeah, I think sometimes it's really country specific, and even it's different in like rural areas versus urban areas and stuff like that. I'll say, like, for example, this year I was in Burkina Faso and I was in Niger, but I also went to Nigeria. And even the difference between those countries is very big, right? So Burkina Faso has like this very revolutionary history with Thomas Sankara in the 80s. And that's something that is like very close to home for people. Burkina Faso's national identity is shaped by that revolution, because before the country was called Upper Volta. And basically I would argue like Thomas Sankara killed Upper Volta so that Burkina Faso, this revolutionary idea of what a country can be, could live. So there's this very revolutionary national identity. In the 80s, it's not that long ago, so a lot of people were alive during that time and remember that. That's very different from like Nigeria, for example, which is a country I respect. Actually, my mom is from there, so I have very personal ties and connections to Nigeria. But there's very wide class disparities, and then there's like a lot of Hollywood influence, and like there's this like Hollywood lifestyle that's promoted. So I think it can really, really depend on like where you are.
There's a name for it too. A lot of movies out of it.
Oh yeah, Nollywood. The Nollywood. Yeah.
You're in Nigeria. Your mother's from Nigeria, so you do have a closer connection to the continent. And now you're in, let's just go right to it. Tell us about Burkina Faso. What's going on? Why should people be concerned? I know one time we had a program because there were some assassination attempts against Ibrahim Traore. So what's going on in there? Why is the United States see them, or do they?
Yeah.
As a enemy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important for people to understand. So Burkina Faso is part of a group of 3 countries called the Alliance of Sahel States. It's Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And these countries formed this alliance with the goal of unifying their country in the same Pan-African vision that was promoted by Nkrumah, by Marcus Garvey. More than 100 years ago, Marcus Garvey wrote this poem called Hail United States of Africa, this vision of a unified Africa. The Alliance of Sahel States is like the current struggle to achieve this goal of a unified Africa. So all of these 3 countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, are currently working really, really hard to cut ties with the countries that colonized them and that colonized Africa, and all these powerful like imperial countries like the United States, France, the European Union as a whole. All 3 countries expelled the French military. So France militarily occupied these countries. They had something called Operation Barkhane, which was like we talk about the war on terror, George Bush, 2001. France has also been involved in this in their own way. And it's claiming that they're fighting terrorism, all of this.
No, you just said claiming that they're fighting.
Yes.
You want to expand on that?
So this is really, really important to understand as well. I keep saying it, but it is. In 2022, Mali's Prime Minister, Abdoulaye Maïga, stood before the United Nations General Assembly, and he said something very powerful. He said that France, which has claimed to support terrorism, has actually provided arms and intelligence and other forms of material support to the terrorist organizations that it claims to be fighting against. And since that time, the leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have repeatedly stated that they have proof, that they have evidence that France is arming and backing terrorist organizations in this region of Africa. Of course, we don't hear about that out here. And I'm sure that it's very, very controversial of a statement, but this is something that, when you're in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the overwhelming majority of the population and the leadership agree on this point.
Wow. So those were French colonies, those 3 countries.
They were colonized by France. Yes.
How about the United States? Is it part of that? Because I remember just recently, I read an article in the Washington Post where Trump was bombing, was it in, I think it was Niger, the so-called militants.
So, okay, there's a lot going on even with the U.S. So what I'll say is this. So in 2023, Niger had a revolution as well. Niger was home to the largest U.S. military drone base in Africa. So the U.S. military has something called AFRICOM, which is the Africa Command. So the United States military has divided up the entire world into several different commands. So they control, like, basically the earth, right? And every single country in Africa, except for Eritrea, signed some sort of military agreement with AFRICOM. Niger is the very first country to revoke the agreement, tear it up, and say that all U.S. military presence is illegal in Niger. And so they shut down what was actually the U.S. Air Force's largest construction project in history, Air Base 201 in a city called Agadez in Niger. And then they shut down another U.S. military base in the capital city called Niamey, and several CIA bases that were operating in Niger. And so since that time, the United States has moved into Nigeria. And so now, unfortunately, Nigeria is collaborating with AFRICOM, with the U.S. military, and they've agreed to potentially open up a base right on the border between Nigeria and Niger. So it would be getting the U.S. military as close as possible to those three countries that are having their revolutions. And so the U.S. is trying to get back in there. Recently, and this is something published in the Washington Post, I'm not sure if this is what you saw, it was very concerning. Donald Trump, so the Washington Post published an article saying that Donald Trump was considering bombing Mali to fight against terrorists.
Right.
And then Mali came up forward and said, we've had no conversation about this. We've never consented to this. If Trump starts bombing our country, that's just an attack on our soil. Like, this is not something that they have anything to do with. But we're seeing right now really heightened global U.S. imperialist aggression everywhere. So it's very scary and very concerning that, Trump is flirting with this idea of bombing one of Africa's freest and most self-determining countries.
Well, he also bombed in Nigeria.
Yes.
So was that the same scheme?
Unfortunately, I mean, it's really, really sad with the situation in Nigeria right now. Bola Tinubu, the president of Nigeria, is somebody...
Say his name again.
Bola Tinubu.
Mm-hmm. He's
backed by the U.S. Actually, so he's somebody who has a criminal record in the United States. He was involved in, like, a heroin trade in Chicago when he lived in the U.S. So he's very easy to blackmail. The U.S. has a lot of dirt on him. So he's very submissive to the U.S. So the United States bombed Nigeria, and he came forward and said, "Oh yeah, we're giving them permission." It's very sad, but it's terrible. The United States has killed many Nigerian civilians this year.
So he was probably installed with the help of the U.S.
Yes,
Okay.
I think it's very safe to say that he's U.S. installed. I mean, he wasn't the popular candidate during the last election. It was really looking like somebody else, Peter Obi, would win. He was installed, and then again, like, the United States has all this dirt on him, and so he really does anything the United States wants him to do.
Okay, let's go back to Burkina Faso. A lot of people are excited because we see them as the current day Cuba, who survived the attacks, the numerous attacks on their sovereignty. So what would you tell people about why should we be supporting the Sahel states, and specifically Burkina Faso?
So Burkina Faso has something called the popular, or I'll say in English it's better translated as the Progressive People's Revolution. So the Progressive People's Revolution is the name of the revolutionary process that's unfolding in Burkina Faso right now. This is a country that has been colonized and exploited for so long, even though it has that revolutionary legacy with Sankara. Sankara was killed after 4 years. And so now we have another young captain who's in power, and he's really pushing forward for this country to become a country that represents African self-determination. So we're seeing a really big focus on a couple things. One of them is industrialization. Colonialism, sometimes we get confused about what it means, but really the heart of colonialism is this idea that African countries are going to export their raw materials. They're going to, like, their economy is just going to be about extracting what's under their soil or extracting the crops that they grow and then importing everything produced outside of Africa. That's why, Congolese resources like cobalt and coltan, etc., are used to make iPhones, but then, they're exported or smuggled out, and then the Congolese people buy the technology, their iPhone. That's how the African economies are set up. Burkina Faso is saying no more to this, right? So we want to produce as much as we can, develop our industries and produce at home. Also, Thomas Sankara back in the day in the 80s had this quote where he said, "Where is imperialism? Look at your plate," to talk about, the foods that we eat. They're not locally grown foods. Well, Burkina Faso announced at the end of 2025 that it can say that it has achieved food sovereignty after just a couple years of really, really increasing its production. So it no longer has to import rice. Right, imported rice is banned. Just very recently, like within the last couple weeks, they banned the importation of flour, of couscous, of semolina, which is another similar like starchy food. They've banned. You cannot import this because they have the capacity now to produce. Yeah, they can produce it. They can feed their population now without relying on these imports. So this is a really, really big deal. So
their food's self-sustaining at this time?
They are at this time. So as of December 2025, they have achieved their goal. And it's incredible. When France colonized this region of Africa, they basically like brainwashed or like, they had the psychological warfare where they convinced people that this is like barren land. They said this is just desert land. You're close to the Sahara. You're right under the Sahara. You can't grow anything. Burkina Faso is growing pineapples. They're growing all these things that it's like they're never supposed to even try growing these things, and they're successfully growing all of these crops that were supposed to be allegedly impossible.
Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré.
Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré.
So I heard he also gave tractors away to the farmers.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yes. I mean, one of the most powerful videos, I've been looking for it. I need to find it where it is. It's just one example, but there's this rural farmer, and he's just crying, and he's speaking in the local language, and he's talking about how he's never had as successful of a yield in his life as he has had in recent times under President Traoré. So we've seen the distribution of tractors, fertilizers, seeds, all sorts of farming equipment, fishing equipment.
They just give it to the property.
They just give it. Yeah, they give it out to different communities.
Goodness.
Yeah.
They don't have to buy it at top.
No, they're distributing these resources to rural communities.
It's socialist.
It is. I mean, it is. I mean, it's true that they haven't said the word.
Yes.
And sometimes people get upset. Like, why aren't they saying it? Why aren't they saying it? But what else do you call it when your country is taking control over the economy, nationalizing, different sectors of the economy, and distributing resources, developing programs, social programs? That's the word for it.
And the Cubans weren't afraid. They called it communism, which is a radical means to achieve socialism.
Yes.
But we get caught up into this because
Yes.
we've been so brainwashed to, as socialist, then people don't know what it is. Talk about that for a hot second. And how are the people feeling? How are the people accepting? Is there any opposition? What's going on?
Overwhelmingly, the vast majority of people in Burkina Faso really support President Ibrahim Traoré. There are regular mobilizations all of the time where people go out in, the hundreds and the thousands and, the tens of thousands. They go out into the street to talk about their support for the Progressive People's Revolution. I've been to a couple mobilizations just this year, and I've been in California for a couple months. So really, this is at the beginning of this year. I was at a couple of these mobilizations. And so there's so much popular support. There's something called the Wanya, which is also called the Citizens Night Watch, it's like a network of different grassroots organizations that have formed under one umbrella to serve as the eyes and ears of the revolution. They go out into the streets, into like the early hours of the morning, just to make sure that everything's okay. This is why whenever there is an assassination attempt or a coup attempt, you can see that people are out mobilizing within minutes, because they are already organized among themselves to respond to these sort of threats. There's also something called the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland. These are like civilian turned combatant fighting forces that pick up arms to fight against these, I have to say Western-backed terrorist organizations, because that's how we're always calling them in the Sahel, in this region. We always say Western-backed terrorist organizations. And so there are so many people who have signed up to fight that President Traoré has actually said, no, we're going to need to mobilize people in other sectors. Not everybody's going to be on the front lines with the arms. So now they have Faso Mebo, which is where people receive military training, they receive patriotic political education, and they also receive training to do road construction, infrastructure building, on all of this. And so now they have these road brigades that are building up the country and doing all this work to build infrastructure.
Last year, there was a general. He was the head of AFRICOM back then. I think his name was Michael Langley. Mm-hmm. And he was testifying in front of Congress. He said, well, there's this leader in Burkina Faso who was taking all the gold and keeping it for himself. Did you recall that?
I remember this, yes.
Tell us that but what happened seemed like, did the people come out in the street?
Oh yeah, we were there. I mean, the Thomas Sankara Center, my organization, we were out there. We protested. A lot of people came out into the streets in really big numbers across the country. So, in cities and in villages alike, to protest against.
I heard there were some protests here in the States too. Is that correct?
Yes, and I saw some in the States. I saw some in Europe. I think in London and maybe Paris. So people around the world, they had like a day in solidarity with Burkina Faso.
So basically, saying if you have to come through us,
yes,
to get to him.
Yes,
Ooh.
and I have to say, like, Burkina Faso is still under threat, very much so. Like, just this year, maybe about a month ago, the European Parliament, which represents the European Union, passed a series of resolutions condemning President Ibrahim Traoré, and then 2 months before, they did the same thing for Niger. So the EU has basically put out their position, which is that they feel that Ibrahim Traoré and then Chani, who's the president of Niger, they need to be removed, and they don't support these. They're cracking down, and so there's a lot that we're facing.
What's the justification for that?
Oh, the same thing they always say. It's not democratic. Where's the free speech? They always use the same human rights violations. These are the same kind of things they say about Cuba. They say this about, every revolution.
Oh, yeah. Cuba has so many human rights violations. It's like free health care for everybody. Oh, my God, human rights. Oh, let me see. The U.S. has a blockade that's starving people, but they have their human rights.
Right. They always, all the time. It's like the same. And you never, ever hear about, like, a resolution passed against imagine if the European Union passed a resolution against the United States for all of these things, like human rights violations, ICE, freedom of speech. The media company I used to work for, African Stream, was shut down by the U.S. State Department, but there's no outcry about we need to pass a resolution. There's no freedom of speech, but there you go, the hypocrisy.
So you're there in Burkina Faso. Do you see any evidence of the U.S. propaganda coming in? Because they're good at this propaganda. I think in Iran, they had to shut down the internet. And people said, oh, like that was a bad thing. But they said, no, because you're putting stuff out there.
Yeah. I would say, like, in Burkina Faso in particular, right now, the Progressive People's Revolution is very strong because they really do have the masses, and the people are not divided on the question of Ibrahim Traoré at all right now. I think where things get more complicated is, like, even during my brief trip to Nigeria, I saw that, like, outside, like in the neighboring countries, people are becoming propagandized against Ibrahim Traoré. Like, there was a couple of interviews, especially like the month of, maybe March, I think, or was it April? There was like the big German news outlet DW put out stuff about how Ibrahim Traoré hates democracy and hates free speech. And then there was a Sky News lady. They sent somebody they always send an African, right? So they send like a Sudanese woman to go and basically talk about how Burkina Faso is not what it seems like, and just like spewing all this negative propaganda against Burkina Faso. And so there's been a really concerted media effort, and it's hitting other Africans outside of Burkina Faso right now more than it's hitting Burkina Faso.